Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Apostate Anne podcast, where we take a critical and scholarly approach to religion and its impact in our society. I'm Mark Peralta.
And I'm Apostate Anne.
If you went to school in our public education system, you were likely taught evolution in the science classroom. But as it turns out, that hasn't always been the case. And then for that, we have Apostate Anne, who's got a very interesting take on this, where we're going to learn about what she calls the evolution of evolution in schools.
That's
I'm excited.
right.
I'm glad we put this together, and I can't wait to hear all the facts that you're going to share with us.
This is an important subject because it's really divisive in our society today. And we'll talk about some of the ways we're still seeing the impact of this right now. But taking it back to 1859, when Charles Darwin published his book on the origins of species. Since then, science has never been the same, because this was the first time that they took data from nature to be able to support this theory of evolution. Prior to this, schools were teaching creationism, which is the biblical Genesis account that the God of the Bible created everything and all the living beings. So the theory of evolution now presented a challenge to that notion. So as academic acceptance of evolution grew and was taught in school, the religious opponents responded by fighting to ban teaching evolution and became advocating for teaching creationism instead. And this has ignited what has grown to be a full-on war between the religious opponents and the public education system. So much so that, as you probably know, a lot of families are now opting to homeschool, send their kids to private school. And one of the main reasons is this topic right here, teaching creationism versus teaching evolution. So today we're going to be talking about how and why creationism became illegal to teach in the public schools in the US.
Yeah, this is awesome. So you mentioned that there are some people that are against this. I can only imagine these are theists at the very least. But when it comes to Christian or believers of the God of the Bible, there's a whole spectrum of people that interpret the creation accounts of Genesis. Like, you have some that will hold to a very literal 6-day creation account where God did it in 24 hours times 6. And then there are some who hold a view where each day is more of a figurative epoch or a phase of time, kind of an abstract time frame. But where do you think, who are exactly of those that are opposing teaching evolution in school?
That's a good question, because there's plenty of Christians who do accept evolution. So this isn't like a Christian position, but these religious opponents are known as fundamentalists. So I want to really define what that is, because it is an official movement. So what is meant by fundamentalism? Fundamentalism is a religious or social movement that seeks to institutionalize past traditions and sees the secular state as an enemy. Okay, so in terms of these groups, they see the public school system as wanting to remove God from the education system. So they kind of feel like they're intentionally trying to remove religion. And then the impact that they believe that will have is that when you don't have God, then you're robbed of your life's purpose and meaning or moral compass. So this is the fundamentalist worldview. And part of it is they're upholding the sacred texts as infallible, and they value traditional social roles. They believe that religious truths apply universally, like medical or scientific truths, and they reject a separation between state and church. So they believe this is the truth above all. And so it really creates a problem when there's science, evidence that is challenging their beliefs that's supposed to be unquestionable. They're holding that this is the ultimate truth.
Wow, yeah, it very much sounds like the very conspiratorial type, which is, that type of mentality is part of what, we see wrong in religion, in embracing conspiracies or theories about the government doing things against us because the devil is behind all this and all that. It really is detrimental to not only the progress, of our society, but also to our minds. Because as long as you have folks that are wanting to get in the way of progress of science, where we are actually discovering truths and coming up with better explanations about how the world works and everything, it's just going to slow us down.
The fundamentalists have sort of demonized, like, oh, they're trying to suppress us, they're removing our freedom of speech, they're trying to remove God. So we're going to really examine that. We're going to look at the reasons why the government decided to make teaching creationism illegal. And that way we can see for ourselves, are these reasons legitimate?
This war on teaching evolution in the education system, how did this begin? When did this whole thing start?
Good question. It's a great question because really it started with the publication of Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And in 1878, the US Supreme Court declared separation of church and state. And first of all, I want to talk about the First Amendment because that's a good foundation to lay. So the First Amendment says Congress shall make no laws respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise. It protects the freedom of speech, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, part of that, there's two provisions within it. And it says that a government cannot create or support a religion. And with that, too, there's sort of precedence, which comes later on, which we'll talk about, the Lemon Test. The other provision is a free exercise clause, which is you're free to practice religion as long as it doesn't interfere with others. Okay, so fair enough. Freedom of speech. Government can't promote a religion, but they can't take away rights. And, just as long as everybody's not interfering with everybody else's religion, that's how we do things.
For those in the audience that don't know what the Lemon Test is, what's the Lemon Test?
So it's based on a court case in 1971, Lemon versus Kurtzman, and they came up with a standard, 3 questions. And if it follows these 3 questions, then it passes the Lemon Test. So this has been fundamental in many cases that we'll talk about, where they look at the case and they ask themselves, okay, is the purpose? The purpose must be secular. So if it's not secular, then it doesn't pass the Lemon Test. It must predominantly secular effect, like impact, and it's not excessive entanglement between the government and religion. So we'll talk more about, give different examples of something that would or wouldn't pass that test.
Okay.
So let's get into the court cases. So, like I said, it started with separation of church and state. Well, after the theory of evolution had support from the Charles Darwin book, there was a teacher that started teaching evolution. And it was in 1925. It was called the monkey trial because it was a teacher versus the state. The state was suing the teacher for teaching evolution, and the state won. So it was actually illegal to teach evolution at that time.
What do you know? What state?
I think that was Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, makes sense. Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm. Most of these are actually.
So they were the first one to make evolution in schools illegal to teach.
Yes. So initially, they're still teaching creationism about 100 years ago.
One thing I do want to add to Darwin's thing. So it wasn't just his book only. Like there were others already before him that, like Lamarck, that were already teaching some sort of naturalistic explanation for biodiversity. His book just basically made it so clear that you couldn't deny it because of the evidence that he brought.
Exactly. Yeah. The theory was already out there and believed by many scientists, but this was the first time they really demonstrated with nature examples that it was supporting that theory.
Yeah, because I know some will say, well, it's just a book. How can you just trust this one guy or whatever? But it's in fact a whole school, a whole tradition that led to that and then continued on testing. And then, and then the predictions that were made were then demonstrated and things like that. So It's not just about
Yeah.
the book. Yeah.
And it hasn't just been about teaching evolution. So it's also been about other ways that religion and government kind of are opposing one another. For example, in 1962, Engel versus Vitali, school officials were wanting to recite prayer in the public school. And they were saying that it violated their First Amendment to not be able to. And so this was the first time that the government said, no, you can't recite a prayer in school. And this doesn't violate the First Amendment right because you are promoting your religion. This is primarily, it didn't pass the Lemon test, even though the Lemon test wasn't around just yet. Between 1925, 1962, about 40 years have passed, and they're really trying to enforce the separation of church and state and really implementing policy to where they're saying you cannot pray in school. That's violating the government trying to push a religion, which is what they're not allowed to do.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And it's important because around this time in the 60s, 70s, that's when, as more science came out, more people are accepting the science. Well, now the religious community is trying to paint science as supporting their religion. And they started calling it things like creation science. So instead of creationism, it's now creation science or scientific creationalism, where they're
Mhm.
trying to harmonize some of the scientific theories with the biblical account.
Yeah, they keep rebranding and rebranding as new discoveries come out.
Yeah, and because of that, during that time, lots of states were having their internal battles of whether to teach creationism or evolution, and is it pushing religion or is it suppressing religion? And so officially in 1968, Epperson versus Arkansas, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court shut down attempted prohibition of teaching evolution. So this is the very first time it becomes officially unconstitutional not to teach evolution. So they said you cannot prohibit the teaching of evolution, it must be taught. So that was a big milestone. Then in 1975, Daniel versus Waters in Tennessee, they were trying to propose, okay, so sure, you have to teach evolution, but let's try equal time teaching evolution and teaching creationism. So they were trying to
Uh-huh.
argue this. It was
Let's
called
be fair.
exactly the equal time law. And that was struck down by the US Court of Appeals. So then in 1982, McLean versus Arkansas Board of Education, then they were trying to say, okay, so maybe it won't be equal time, but we'll have balanced treatment. Like we'll just teach both. And they had a specific book about teaching creationism. And again, they're trying to make it like scientific. And so, sure, it's not equal time, but we're still going to teach it there. So in 1982, the judge rules creationism as not scientific. And this was huge because they were funding evolution research.
The government was?
The government, like, right, how they support sciences and research, they were funding evolution research and not funding the study or science of creationism because they said this is not a science, this does not deserve funding. So that was another milestone. Our politicians aren't scientists, and so they have to really understand what's the scientific argument for creationism, what's the scientific argument for evolution, is it real, like is it evidence-based, is it proven? And they're having to understand all this before they can make these judgment calls. And so they looked into the science of creationism, this scientific creationism, and there was no science to actually support it. I'm going to go into all the reasons why led them to that decision. Just to give an example for this, one of the reasons is their argument for supporting creationism was to try to poke holes in evolution. And so they were saying, well, that's not evidence for your belief. That's a dual dichotomy that if it's not this, well, then it has to be this. And that was their argument, which was not scientific because a lot of their claims or their problems that they had with evolution was really just their misunderstanding of evolution.
Sounds like they're using logical fallacies. I'm not too surprised.
So that leads us to 1987, Edwards versus Aguiar. that challenged the Creation Act, which was to always teach both. Okay, so then we went through, okay, it's not equal time. Okay, it's not balanced treatment. Okay, now it's not even teach both. No, you cannot teach creationism. Now at 1987, it's basically unconstitutional to teach creation science, which I mentioned the book. The book was called Panda's Book. They can't teach that book as science. So we went from in less than 100 years, they ruled that evolution shouldn't be taught and it was illegal, to all the way that creationism was illegal to teach. And now evolution is the accepted standard of science.
That seems like a long time.
It takes time to adopt and understand the evidence and look at it. Just to speak to a few more cases that were pivotal after that. In 1990, it was ruled not violating a teacher's freedom of speech to not teach creationism. So they tried to argue, well, you are interfering with that teacher's freedom of speech. They should be able to teach creationism if they want to. And so they were saying, no, it's not a violation of freedom of speech. You cannot teach this false teaching.
In fact, as a former classroom science teacher, I would say that a teacher's beliefs are completely irrelevant. Your job as a teacher is to teach the standards, and whatever the standards specify, that's what you teach. So your own personal freedom of speech here, it's completely irrelevant. The school board specifies what you teach, not your own.
Exactly.
Although there is some freedom, there's some flexibility with how you're going about doing it, but essentially they make sure by law what has to be taught.
Mm-hmm. For good reason, which we'll get into. Then they tried to come back and rebrand the creationism or science creationism package and now say it's intelligent design. So they looked at the argument and they said there's no difference between creationism and intelligent design. You're just changing the name from creationism to intelligent design, but it's essentially the same argument. So they shut that down in 1997. In 2000, they further uphold this decision because I think this one case involved someone wanting to read a disclaimer when teaching evolution. So they're like, okay, fair enough. We'll teach evolution, but we'll just read this disclaimer beforehand and say, hey, this is just a theory. There are other theories out there, that kind of thing. Exactly. So the Supreme Court said, nope, you can't do that. You can't read a disclaimer. It is what it is. We've already decided on this. There's no new argument. And then further cases in 2000, in a court case, the prayer cannot be led at school. It violates the Establishment Clause, which we talked about, government pushing a religion. And then in 2001, child evangelism, the Supreme Court ruled religious organizations can meet at school buildings after hours. I wanted to mention that because I wanted to show that it's not just the court saying no, no, no to religion. They're truly trying not to impose religion on others. They're truly trying to have a separation of church and state. And this is one where they ruled in their favor. They can meet at the school after hours.
Yeah, it's crazy. I remember during the weekend there at the elementary school that I worked, they would hold church services. They utilized the building for these new churches that are just starting out. And so
public funded facilities to have their non-tax paying events at.
Yeah, at the school cafeteria, where there are always concerns about safety, things that can go wrong at a school. You've got civilians that are non-school people at school property on Sunday in many schools. That's kind of odd.
Yeah. And, I've heard of other things like church handing out Bibles outside the school and things like that really they should not be. Okay, so now we're going to get into the reasons why. So would you mind putting that up there? And I think this is important so you can look at it critically too and say, is this fair? Should they be teaching creationism illegal? Well, let's look at the reasons. So this was the legal reasonings for ruling against fundamentalism. So as I mentioned before, the first reason was the fallacy of false dichotomy, contrived dualism. And this is the notion that if evolution is not true, that must mean that creationism is true. So all they did was attack evolution, highlight the unknowns, like, oh, well, we don't know this part. That doesn't mean it's not true. That just is unknown. There's lots of other knowns and lots of other evidence that's pointing to the fact that evolution is true. And as I mentioned, they didn't have any evidence to support creationism as being true.
Yeah, definitely the burden of proof is on, whoever proposes the theory. And in the case of evolution, it's scientific fact. It's already been demonstrated. And not until another theory that someone comes up with or that is discovered that is able to demonstrate and make it where it makes no sense to accept the other one, then it's going to get rejected. You can't just say, well, this isn't true, therefore what my book says must be true. That still needs to be demonstrated. In other words, we still, like, if there is a God who created the universe, you need to show evidence of how this God did it.
Mm-hmm.
The mechanism,
First,
like,
that he exists,
do.
then that he could create, that there's some kind of mechanism to create, and then that he did create, the evidence that he was responsible for that. There's a lot of assumptions there.
Mm-hmm.
So in response to the fundamentalist argument highlighting the unknowns, the court's argument was, well, just because it's unknown today doesn't mean it's going to be unknown tomorrow. So that's not a good enough reason. Second reason is they were saying that it's really religion disguised as science, because as we mentioned before, it didn't meet the standard to be considered a scientific theory. Part of it being a scientific theory is it has to be falsifiable, and what they were claiming, there was nothing that was falsifiable in creationism. So there was nothing to even make it fit the criteria to be considered a scientific theory in the first place, much less for it to trump evolution.
Right. So when it comes to creationism, is religion really disguised as science.
Exactly. The opponents of evolution were ministry motivated. Really, they were concerned with what a godless society would result in and how it would affect people morally. And they were more concerned about the soul of the person than their religion being spread and people believing in their God versus truth and really explaining what really happened and what the evidence is pointing to.
Yeah. They just want to confirm that their book is telling the truth because their God is true.
Mm-hmm. It's a way to have the education system legitimize their beliefs when it hasn't been legitimized through evidence. So, number 4, creationism depends on the supernatural. We have the evidence for laws of nature, physics, chemistry, and those you can test, you can recreate. Those are falsifiable. Those are in line with the reality that we see and observe. But to believe in creationism is to only believe in the supernatural. I don't know how Adam and Eve could have kids and they have kids and they don't have genetic problems due to incest. I'm just going to believe God naturally worked all that out. That's all relying on the opposite of what we know to be true.
Yeah, and not to mention all the flaws just within the narrative itself. If you think critically through everything, like when Cain was banned, right, from Adam and Eve's household, and the story goes that he then found a wife. Where did she come from? I thought Adam and Eve were the first humans ever. There's flaws in the logic of the order of creation as well, like light existing or being the sun being created after plants and things of that nature
After
that we know
days.
couldn't have happened at all. It would have been impossible for that to be the case. So there's just so much more about it.
Exactly. We know snakes don't talk. We know there was no global flood based on geological evidence. There's just a lot of science that has disproven biblical claims. All right. Number 5, there's no secular purpose. So if they started teaching creationism, it's not promoting truth or promoting evidence. It's truly only to advance their religion. So it doesn't pass the lemon test that we mentioned. Number 6, it violates the First Amendment, was the argument. The Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So they can't be allowing the promotion of religion, especially if it's contrary to evidence.
Yeah, that's right. That First Amendment is a double-edged sword. Yeah, you have the freedom to believe whatever you want, but then we cannot support that. That
Yeah,
has to be on you, not us.
you
Right?
got that.
Mm-hmm.
So at number 7, they cannot restructure science curriculum solely for the purposes of fitting the religious claims. So they're wanting to make special pleading, like teach this anyway, even though that's not what the scientific evidence is pointing to. So they're saying you can't interfere in school's curriculum. Like we would be teaching this if religion wasn't pushing their idea. And so they said it doesn't encourage academic freedom. So part of they were arguing like, okay, well, if you allow academic freedom, then you should be allowing the teaching of creationism. You're holding back academic freedom, right? But they're saying no, this is not supported by science, and therefore it's not encouraging academic freedom, it's supporting academic freedom because that's what the academics is pointing to. And to teach something else would be contrary to academic freedom for truth.
Yeah, especially when it's no different than a fairy tale. Abracadabra, that's not science.
Especially when we have an alternative explanation that is supported by DNA that we can see and observe and study that we did evolve over time, and we evolved from another species of apes because we're part of the ape family. We're another species of apes, modern apes. And that's what the genetic evidence supports. It doesn't make sense that we were created separately based on the genetic evidence that we have. Okay, so moving to number 9, intelligent design is not a new science, but an old religious argument, the theory that complexity equals God. Well, it must be from God. How else would you have something this complex and intelligent? And they're saying that's not a new argument. That's old. Like we know now that complexity can be explained with evolution and it doesn't equal God. All right, number 10, the wedge document written by intelligent design movement. So the goal was to defeat scientific materialism because it destructs morals and culture. So the whole wedge document, it's putting a wedge in our society. People are going to become immoral and it's going to impact our society. So that was their argument. And the court ruled against that that's not necessarily the case. Again, I mentioned before special pleading, making a special exception for science. So it's favoritism for a specific religion. Not all religions teach creationism or the world came to be this way.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That to like try to appeal to a freedom of religion, yet we do know that the creationism that fundamentalists are interested in peddling in schools is the biblical creation. But no one's asking Muslims how their God created the world, and they're not
Yeah.
going to be exclusive of those theories. They're not considering what Eastern religions have to say as well. And so that is very much a case of special pleading.
That's right.
I guarantee you, if they were to include Quranic things, they would be like, no, we can't have that. That's
Exactly.
the double standard.
We want you to give us religious freedom, but not those other religions to our children. No.
Yep.
Number 12, school is for academic progression, not religious advancement. School is not voluntary. Church is. Like, you want your kid to learn that? Send them to church. School is mandated, and therefore we can't teach this religious teaching that's only for the purposes of advancing your religion in public school where children have to be taught this. Number 13, it misrepresents the acceptance in the scientific and academic community. Overwhelmingly, the scientific and academic community believes in evolution, supports it. They see the evidence for it. So for school to teach something otherwise would not be reflective of the academic scientific community.
Yeah, and not to mention that within Christendom, I think the only ones that reject evolution are more of the Christian Protestant side. I think the Catholic Church eventually accepted it. I think there was Pope John Paul II who wrote something ex cathedra or whatever, where that sort of became canonized. So the Catholic Church does embrace evolution. It's primarily the Protestants that are the problem.
Yep. This is a primarily Protestant movement. Exactly. Number 14, attacks on the problem with evolution have been refuted. So, as I mentioned before, the areas where they're like, no, this is wrong about evolution, they realize, no, you just misunderstand it. This is true and this is why. And so the attacks were refuted.
And I would say not just misunderstood, but sometimes even like willingly lying about it. I think some of these guys are being deceitful.
We know some scientists that have been corrected and demonstrated the evidence, and they still continue to repeat their rhetoric. Okay, number 15, the National Academy of Sciences, the most prestigious scientific association, was a third party and agreed to review the evidence for evolution. So, like I said before, you could argue, well, these court people, they don't know the science. Well, they brought in the leading academic source to review the evidence as well as the Panda book that I was saying that they were using to promote creation science. It demonstrated to be flawed. So looking at that, they were saying, no, this is misrepresenting science. No, that's not how science works. No, that's not true. And so they validated the evolution claims and disproved the Panda claims. Or they pointed out how they misunderstood the science because they were trying to use that to support creationism. So number 17, ideas intelligent design. Intelligent design does not give explanation to explain nature. It requires the suspension of natural laws.
And then also it utilizes a lot of this fallacy of ignorance, like looking at a snowflake. I'm not saying that's an example they use, but just as an example, you look at the snowflake and then like all the intricate designs that you see there, or like how the things are arranged and whatnot. And then be like, well, I can't think of a scientific explanation for this, or I'm going to refute the current explanation for this from the science community, and then argue that, well, how else could it be? Well, there must have been some designer, because who else? Assuming that they're right in the beginning and they just have to make everything fit.
Yeah, they're justifying and tweaking here and there to make it work. So this one that I just read about, it requires a suspension of natural laws, is sort of the other side to believing in the supernatural. So sometimes you're not only believing in the supernatural, but you're also believing that the natural laws that we do know all of a sudden failed to exist. That brings us to the American Association of the Advancement of Science, which is the largest organization of scientists, said that the lack of scientific warrant makes it inappropriate to teach in science classes. So again, they not only supported evolution, but they said that the theory of creationism lacked scientific warrant and it was inappropriate to teach in science class if it's not scientific. Number 19, the absence of peer-reviewed publication, research, or data supporting the theory. As we said, there's no evidence to support creationism and therefore no publications to present the information, none of the support that evolution had. And last, they ruled that it's not the business of the government or education system to respond to a religious doctrine.
That's all it is. It's just a doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
There really is no foundation, no scientific foundation for this, this account of creation.
And we can talk about in a future episode the evidence to support evolution, because I'd really like to get into that and support this episode even more. But I wanted to at least show the history of the war that's been going on and how important it is, which leads me to current day on what's going on in this battle. So this is how fundamentalism is impacting the education system today. Now, I'm only speaking about our local public school system, but these are some of the things that we're seeing right now. Number one is the banning of books. They're trying to censor books that are teaching immoral things. That's part of fundamentalism affecting the education system in other ways. In our state, it is law that all the public schools must post on the front door a sign that says, "In God We Trust," at all the public school entrances. So this is a way that fundamentalism has already infiltrated the public school system. Another way is they're restricting the rights under the LGBT community. I think we've probably heard nationally in the news, sometimes, not allowing transgender children to go to the restroom that matches their gender or their locker room that matches their gender. So those are some of the ways that they're having that out.
You remember a couple of years back, the whole thing about the school that was like putting that there was a school that was a teacher that was allowing litter boxes in the classroom because she had some kid that identified as a cat. And so she was
Oh my
accommodating for this
gosh.
kid. Yeah, it was a huge deal all over the news. And as it turns out, it wasn't even true. Like this was not the case.
Oh man. They
And
like
that's how
to
they like
over
build
dramatize
over it.
it.
Yeah, it's this satanic panic. Like it's all disease.
Fear mongering, yes. Another one is sex education restriction. So, I think most people in the public school system probably receive some form of sex education. Well, this fundamentalist movement is wanting to have people have to opt in to receive that education. They have to have approval for each child, which makes a huge barrier to get all these approvals. And that's, kind of anti science in a way. I mean, I understand you can teach morality at home, but I mean, there's also education around sex to be had, and there's also harms that can be had without sex education. So next is, so they're trying to replace the counselors with unqualified chaplains. So when I say unqualified, they haven't been trained in, mental health issues or counseling children. They're chaplains, and they're trying to infiltrate the religious spiritual aspect into the schools. And I mean, I understand that, if you're religious, you value that, but that should be something you can do, spiritual counseling outside of school, not something that's being provided and funded by the school.
Yeah, if
And
you
you
want to
wouldn't
go
want that for your
ahead,
child.
yeah, if you want to go ahead and confuse your kids, you go right ahead. Although I'd say you're not being fair to your kids, but
And I understand chaplains are supposed to be more spiritual, like not identified with a specific religion. I understand that. But I think in this case, the schools are addressing the psychological and physiological needs of the child and not the spiritual.
yeah, and that this part about unqualified, that's very common because generally these chaplains will have attended some theological seminary or some sort of religious institution,
Mm,
and they get a diploma or a certificate or whatnot, which is not necessarily the same uh, academic rigor of like actual psych
hmm.
degrees and counseling degrees. So
Yeah. And that could be dangerous. I mean, kids need professional help. Next is advocating for the 10 commandments being in the classroom. This was struck down, I believe, for obvious reasons. And this is going above the line of pushing your religion. And, some of the arguments that I heard, I listened in on the case is, are you going to put Sharia law on the walls? Are you going to put the satanic rites on the wall? Like, no. And she's like, oh, no, I'm only advocating for 10 commandments and trying to promote morality. And again, it wasn't passing the lemon test. And recently, oh, this is a big one. This is going on right now. They're wanting to incorporate victimization training, anti victimization training in schools, which looks like teaching what abuse looks like, manipulation and someone touching you inappropriately and what to do if that happens. And the fundamentalist movement is wanting that to be also, you have to opt in for that. You have to sign up for that.
oh
So
wow.
creating
Oh,
barriers for education that's can be contrary to religion, because I think some of them want to be able to spank their kids or
yeah, and who knows
punish
what's
how
going
they
on at
want.
home, right? Kids
Yeah.
getting groomed for things. I've heard lots of Mormons talk about how the Mormon church is like actually grooming women for men and stuff like that. And there's a lot of abuse happening at home. So
Mm,
like if this opt-in thing, it's getting in the way of victims from
yeah.
learning
From
things about
coming out, from
for
speaking
coming out.
out.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow, that's so dangerous.
Yes. Well, thank you guys for
Yeah.
listening and learning with us. And hopefully, there'll be more to come on the evidence to support evolution. Stay tuned. There you have it. There's the evolution of evolution being taught in our public school systems in the US.
And it got shut down. So
It's illegal, unconstitutional. It is un-American to teach creationism in the public school system.
All right, folks. Well, remember to like and subscribe, share this video with others, join with your membership, and help us support, keep this going. And don't forget to drop us a comment and let us know what other subjects you're interested in, what you can add to this current conversation. So this has been Apostate of Mind.
Mind.
They call me a god.